Well, welcome everyone. I am Kim DaCosta. I'm a professor here at the Gallatin School. It's really my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's event. It's Glucksman Ireland House, as all of you know, is a really special place. And even more so tonight to celebrate the launch of Kevin Kenny's fascinating new book, The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, Reducing Mobility in the 19th Century United States. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Ireland's Consul General in New York City, Helena Nolan. Thank you for being here. So tonight we have the pleasure of hearing Professor Kenny in conversation with Professor Michael Gomez, two distinguished NYU historians, both of whom engage the complicated relationship between diaspora, migration, colonialism, and race-making in their work. Given their institutional affiliation, and indeed the argument of Kevin's book, it seems especially appropriate to begin tonight with NYU's History Department's land acknowledgement, which is as follows. The Department of History at NYU acknowledges that it is located in ancestral Lenape homelands, and it recognizes the long-standing significance of these lands for the Lenape nations past and present. We're also conscious that New York City has the largest urban native population in the United States. We believe that historical awareness of indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important and are committed to working to overcome their effects in our own educational institutions. We get to listen in on their conversation tonight for about 25 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience, and after which we hope you will stay for the reception and book signing. But first, let me introduce our panelists. Michael Gomez is currently Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. He's also the founding director of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. He's also the founding editor of the Cambridge Studies on the African Diaspora and the general editor of its Cambridge History of the African Diaspora, a 3-volume series scheduled for publication in 2025. Gomez's most recent book, African Dominion, A New History of Empire in Early and Medieval West Africa, was awarded the 2019 African Studies Association's Book Prize and the 2019 American Historical Association's Martin A. Klein Prize in African History. Kevin Kenny is Professor of History and Glucksman Professor in Irish Studies at New York University. Professor Kenny has several books to his name, including Making Sense of the Molly Maguires, The American Irish, A History, Peaceful Kingdom Lost, and Diaspora, A Very Short Introduction, among many other articles. He is, of course, also the director of the Glucksman Ireland House. He somehow has found the time to write his latest book, The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, the subject of our gathering tonight. And with that, I will leave it to the masters to discuss their work.
Thank you, Ken. Well, thank you, Professor DaCosta, and it's a pleasure to be in the room with friends. I know a number of you, but it's really quite a treat to have a conversation with you, Kevin, about this stunning achievement. And what I want to do is just kind of read just a bit and then ask you a few questions before we open it up to the floor. I was really struck by the fact that the book is able to accomplish multiple objectives concomitantly. It actually articulates or brings together the African and Asian experiences through this lens of immigration policy and maintains that the context for subsequent postbellum anti-Asian policies, and indeed providing a collective template for those policies, were the measures taken to police the mobility of free blacks in the antebellum period within the context of slavery, as well as domestic and external slave trades. And second, by presenting American jurisprudence as temporally processual, and by way of a close examination of legal decisions and their justifications, your book argues that control over immigration policy shifts from the state to federal jurisdiction following the Civil War in the effort to regulate Chinese immigration from the 1850s to the 1870s, with arguments against that immigration premised on antebellum, anti-black case law. And in the process, you're able to interrogate shifting meanings and significances of various concepts fundamental to American democracy, such as citizenship, sovereignty, as well as shifting market notions of commerce, the nature of the labor force, and so forth. So this is really a kind of interstitial accomplishment in that you are addressing immigration studies, legal studies, social history, and so forth. So I learned a lot, and I appreciate the effort. Professor DaCosta said something that actually allows me to segue to my first question. That is to say, given your stature as a scholar, an eminent scholar, you're a professor, you have students, you're the director of Ireland House. I'm sure that you have many, many demands upon your time. So before getting into the kind of questions about the book, about what you say, I'm interested in your process. You indicate that it took you 10 years to write this book. How did you accomplish it? I mean, how do you balance your scholarship with all of these demands upon your time?
Firstly, thank you, Mike, for sponsoring this with the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. It's great, I think, that we're doing this. My son Michael is in the audience, and he could tell you what a well-balanced person I am, and how how I never work at night or the weekends. But yeah, it took 10 years. It began 5 years in Boston and 5 years in New York City, and many things happening in those 10 years. But I had done most of my work up to that point as a social historian, interested in the lives of ordinary migrants as the agents of their history, sometimes involved in political protest, often just trying to make a life for themselves. And then I stumbled upon a question. I realized I didn't know the answer to this question. The question was, who had authority over immigration? And that just wasn't a question I had asked. And in fact, when it came up in my teaching, I rather glibly misanswered the question, because I said, well, that's a federal matter. And there's an end to it. And we can talk about that journey. Answering that question, that question was so persistent in my mind. How, in the American case, did a national immigration policy emerge? That sustained me over the last 10 years of chairing a department at Boston College, moving here. The pandemic was, I've said this to many people, the pandemic was a roll of the dice depending on where you were in the life cycle and the professional cycle. My boys were in their 20s. They weren't 2 or 3 years old. I have many colleagues for whom work ground to a standstill. I ran this center remote, and I actually managed to write the book. Just that question, I think if this book has merit, it conveys to the reader the sheer intellectual excitement that I experienced in discovering the richness of the answer to that question. Who controls the mobility of other people, and on what grounds? And I think that's a question that's, with us today. So that was really the process. Yeah, I combined the administrative work, which I enjoy, with the intellectual work. The biggest disappointment of my career would be if I hadn't finished that book, because that's the most important book that I've done.
You mentioned also that in the process of writing the book, you mentioned your engagement with your students.
Yes.
And we have a number of students in the room, and I'm sure that they would be interested to hear about.
Yes, indeed. And Ryan Sullivan, who is here, Ryan, where are you? Ryan is here, and Ryan survived this experience in the immigration history seminar that I teach every year. And I shifted in that seminar from the social history from the bottom up of ordinary people, to try and consider questions of policy, law, constitutional history. I'm self-trained in that. I did it, if you like, inductively and empirically. I looked at the cases. I discovered concepts like diversity of jurisdiction. I had no idea what it meant. Police power, I had no idea what it meant. So I worked outward from the sources, and I did it with my students. And Ryan, I think you can attest to that. And I'm delighted also that the students from my MA seminar are here this evening. So it's very much writing through teaching.
Yeah. I offered a précis at the beginning of our conversation in terms of what I think you were trying to say, or what you are saying in the book. If I didn't get that right, I want to give you an opportunity to present what your major ideas are in the book.
Yeah, no, I think you got it right, Mike. Thank you. So one way you could look at this is the story culminates in a claim by the national government to control borders. And you could say, well, that's self-evident. Doesn't every national government control borders? Well, the answer is yes, in the present. And that was my fallacy, right? That was my ahistorical assumption, because I wasn't much interested in questions of policy. I assumed, well, that's true today, and so that must always have been true. In a political setup like the United States, you can go to the Constitution to see if such a claim can be verified. And the big surprise is if you go to the Constitution, it says nothing about immigration, literally nothing about immigration. It says something about naturalizing foreigners after they have arrived in the country. It provides no grounding for authority over immigration, none at all. So that's odd. And then as a historian, if you look at the subject, you discover that the national government didn't claim or exert control over immigration until the 1860s and 1870s. That's not a coincidence. That's the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I went into this story without knowing how the transition from local to state to federal authority occurred, but knowing that it must have something to do with the two central themes in 19th century American history, which are slavery and westward imperial expansion. That I knew, that the answer would somehow lie there. So it results in a central claim, which is that the existence, abolition, and legacies of slavery shape immigration policy as it moves from the local to the national level over the course of the 19th century in the context of westward imperial expansion. So that's what ties all of those strands together.
Yeah, there's a part in the book where you talk about the Seaman Acts, based out of South Carolina, the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in 1822, and the rise of a series of efforts on the part of South Carolina, which will extend to Georgia and other places, which attempt to try to prohibit or to police the movement of black seafarers along the coast, because of the fear that they are promoting insurrection, moving up from what was Saint-Domingue, becomes Haiti, into other parts, into the South. And that's in an earlier part of the book. And then when you begin to talk about the anti-Asian legislation beginning in the 1850s and perhaps culminating with this 1882 Chinese Expulsion Act, I would like to kind of talk with you about about, although obviously, you know, there's a kind of otherness going on here, yeah, against the African, against the Asian. Was that really the basis for those kinds of efforts? Because it seems that in the case of the Seaman Acts, the question was one of national security. There was a fear of a large insurrection taking place. The anti-Asian measures seem to be very, very targeted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there it seemed that the labor issue was really at the heart of it. I don't know, what would you say?
Yeah. So, I mean, this gets to the heart of the book in many ways. So, following Denmark Vesey's revolt, or the alleged conspiracy of a revolt, South Carolina passed the first of these seaman's laws. And what's interesting there is that they apply not just to foreigners visiting South Carolina, British sailors, but also to sailors coming from the Northeast, from Boston. So this is in the context of a nation-state in formation, right, where state sovereignty is still very important. So that is one mode of what I refer to in the book as police power. The states are exerting their police power to control the mobility of free black people, in this case. There is a court case I read where a ship arrives and the crew, in collusion with the captain, claim to be free in order not to be subject to slave law. But these laws apply only to free black sailors because the presence of free black people in the South contradicts the racial logic of slavery, which is that the natural condition of a person of African descent is slavery. So they end up in court for violating these laws as free black sailors. It is then revealed that they are actually enslaved, and the case is dismissed. So these laws, patrolling, policing free black people, are one example of states controlling their borders. It is a security issue, but it's not really a national security issue. No. I see it as a local security issue. Now, if we jump ahead a generation and we look at the anti-Chinese laws, I don't think it's the seaman laws in particular. It's the system whereby free black people born on the soil were required to register, carry papers, were expelled from the state upon freedom, were excluded from re-entry. That's the precedent I see. Mm-hmm. The only precedent I see for how the Chinese were then treated at the national level, because those state laws, the logic of those state laws is applied to the Chinese at the national level when the federal government comes over. What I would say is, if you look at the antebellum period, when there's a long, long debate over who controls immigration, is it going to be local police power controlling borders, movement within and across borders, or does the national government have a role to play under the commerce power? That's a question that can't be resolved as long as slavery exists. That's my argument. The Civil War removes the political and constitutional obstacles to a national policy, but it doesn't make that policy inevitable. Because if you could picture slavery having been abolished a generation earlier, Congress would not have stepped in and restricted immigration numerically. People didn't like the Irish, but they needed their labor. They were coming in massive numbers. Nobody was calling for the numerical restriction of the Irish. Maybe extend the waiting period for naturalization, maybe prevent paupers from coming in, but nobody's calling for a numerical restriction of European immigrants. Right, so something has to change. There has to be a historical contingency, and that is the arrival of the Chinese. It's the arrival of the Chinese coinciding with the removal of slavery that clears the path to a national policy. There's a tremendous irony in this because Chinese exclusion is ultimately justified on anti-slavery grounds.
Right.
It's just the most pernicious of arguments, which is that all Chinese laborers are coolies, which they're not. Coolies are slaves, which they're not. Therefore, the Chinese should be excluded, because under the 13th Amendment you can't have slavery. So it's a complex genealogy, and that's how I'm tracing it. Ultimately, Chinese exclusion discriminates on grounds of race and class, to get back to the labor question. Race, because it's Chinese. Class, because it's Chinese laborers. There are exemptions for teachers, merchants, diplomats, and others. So there's a class dimension as well.
How are we to understand? So this is a really big question. Yeah, and I don't know if we have enough time for this. Maybe we'll get into it in the Q&A. But as you alluded to, these, what I'm calling anti-otherness immigration laws, are unfolding at a time of massive European immigration. Yeah? Between from 1820 to 1880, some 10 million people are coming from Europe, mostly Irish and Germans. And you spent a lot of time talking about Dred Scott and that 1857 decision determining that Dred Scott had no right to sue in federal court. And one of the remarkable things about your book is that you explore the juristic reasoning of Chief Justice Roger Taney, who distinguishes between the citizen race, quote unquote, and the African race, and argues that naturalization is only for European immigrants who were part of the, quote, dominant race. You stated that during this period in time, you have a number of Europeans coming into the country. Everybody doesn't like that. The Irish will experience hardship. But do you see in Taney's comments a kind of anticipation that at some point, and I'm saying this given the background of so-called whiteness studies, which developed, I guess, in the 80s. I don't know if they're still in vogue or not. But the whole business that there are certain groups who are now considered white, but that's a construct and that was a process. Yeah? So it seems that Taney anticipates a day in which this is going to be resolved for, the notion of the European writ large, as opposed to, at this point, the African. What would you say about that?
Yeah, so firstly, one question about Dred Scott. Dred Scott, I think, is routinely and in one sense fairly described as the worst judicial opinion in American history. The frightening thing about Dred Scott is to consider whether it was good law in its context. In other words, did it's bad history, it's wrong in history. It claims there were no black citizens at the time of the Revolution. Is it sound law in its context? If it is, it's even more frightening, right? This is a line of argument I encountered when writing the book. Dred Scott draws a line that between the citizen race and between people of African descent, a crude and clear line, possibly in an attempt to resolve, in Tony's mind, certain issues. In terms of the status of the Irish, you allude to an older debate on whiteness, and the famous book, How the Irish Became White. That's Noel Ignatieff, and David Roediger was working on this. And this was a generation ago when I started out, actually. This was the stuff in immigration and labor history. I would say that my book answers that question without mentioning it. I never once mentioned the whiteness debate, because it's not a live debate in my thinking or in my field. The way I approach history in this book, at least having moved into the constitutional and political and legal, there's no doubt on which side of the colour line the Irish stand. Irish people, whatever prejudice they encountered, which was plenty, could enter the country. They could move around. They could get jobs. They could naturalize as citizens. They could hold political office. They could vote. They could serve on juries. They could testify. They could do all of the things that most black people could not do at the time. So it's a non-question for me in that sense. Not your question, Mike, but
No, it's okay.
the question of how the Irish became white, because it's not a question the way I'm approaching history in this book.
I want to ask one more thing, because one of the things that's also striking to me is that, with one example, Dennis Kearney, who organized the Workingmen's Party of California against the Chinese in the 1870s.
Yeah.
But throughout the book, you identify specific Irish individuals who seem to have been complicit or were complicit in these anti-otherness movements. Is there anything behind that? Because it seems that in the book you I don't want to say you take pains. But you make clear that, I mean, in some instances they were immigrants themselves.
So it's part of immigration history, right? To see immigrants getting ahead at the expense of others. It could be other immigrants, it could be black people, it could be Chinese Americans. I hope that there isn't something lurking behind it, and that I'm settling scores. What I would say is that this is a book not about primarily, indeed not at all, really about immigrants or black people or native people as agents of their history, so much as it is a book about the ideas, laws, and policies that were crafted to restrict human mobility. And to the extent that certain Irish people did play a role in that, there's not that many of them. There's Kearney, and who is it in the makes that dreadful argument in one of the court cases, even I'm forgetting. But I hope not, Mike. Okay. But they are part of the story, inevitably. And this is a story about the logic of race and sovereignty as applied, again, in my mind, to do this extraordinary thing, which is to dictate the movement of people.
Very good. I think we've come to the end of our one-on-one conversation. I think we want to open it up to the audience for.
And we will pass a mic through both rooms. If anybody has questions, please. Ted Smith here, Fanta at the front.
Happy to kick it off.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Kevin, on
Thank
a
you.
fabulous book, and it's been wonderful reading it. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. And I'm glad you laid waste the nonsense of whiteness. It's a scientific and anthropological rubbish, but it still seems to survive thanks to the US Census. You hardly mention the word at all in your book, which is terrific. Could you explore for me a little bit the constant conflict between the business community wanting cheap labor to come in and the, shall we say, xenophobic or other people who are worried about immigrants and are against them, whether they be Chinese or others? I'm very interested in that. It continues to this day, obviously.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Ted. And one of my former students, Hidetaka Hirota, who some of us in the room know, is grappling with just that question. He's using the working title, The American Dilemma. It's been used before, but the dilemma is precisely the one you identified, with the balance between racially driven and often very ugly restrictions and the need and desire for labour. And I suppose that comes in to this conversation in a couple of ways. One is that despite the prejudice against the Irish, the furthest anyone ever got to restricting them was to say, let's extend the naturalisation period from 5 to 21 years. And the know-nothings, for all of their power, could never get that through, even in Massachusetts. They got a 2-year rule post-naturalization at one point. The Chinese case, obviously, is compelling, because if you want to look for resistance to Chinese exclusion, you'll find it in corporate capital. So you'll find it among the railroad builders and the employers. And this is why Dennis Kearney, Mike, you mentioned, can have such a powerful impact. He's the leader of a working men's party that's anti-monopoly, egalitarian, and anti-Chinese. So that's the dynamic.
I think there are questions in this room as well.
Thank you so much. And I didn't get a chance to read the book, so apologies if this question is redundant. So I was wondering, because this time period coincides with the U.S.'s acquisition of overseas territories, I was wondering how this impacts the structure of the immigration laws that were being formulated at the time, and whether that shows up in the in your research. And if it's in the book, apologies, but yeah, I'm just thinking about empire, overseas empire.
That's a wonderful question, because the culmination of the book is that the claim to authority over immigration is that control over borders is inherent in national sovereignty. It's extra-constitutional. It does not need a constitutional justification. So I went to the Constitution looking for that authority. It's not there. The culmination of the book coming out of Chinese... So you get Chinese exclusion, that needs a justification at the highest level. The justification is, well, you're not going to find it in the Constitution. It's inherent in the sovereignty of nations. Now, there's two other domains of history where precisely that argument is being made, of American history. One is policy towards Native Americans. So it gets to empire because this is internal empire. And the second is the acquisition of overseas territories. So if you want to look for what we call plenary power understood as power inherent in sovereignty, you find it in those three areas. So very, very much a non-redundant question. Thank you. Let's see, Anna.
Hey, so congratulations on this book. What a great topic. I wish I had thought of it. So my question is, in this time period, if you are pro-immigrant, are we better off with local state-controlled policy or national policy? Because your book ends on not a happy note. I mean, the feds take over, boom, Chinese exclusion.
That question is from my friend Anna Law from Brooklyn College, a political scientist who is working on similar topics, very similar topics. And Anna and I discovered that somewhat awkwardly 3 or 4 years ago. Again, our mutual friend Hidetaka Hirota brought this to our attention. And so we had lunch, and we discovered a mutual interest in good food, and then in this topic. And Anna and I have been working on this, hence Anna's mordant introduction. What a great topic. I wish I had thought of it, because she thought of it, and it's great that we're working on this. To answer your question, Anna, if you look at Reconstruction, and the book does end on that heavy note, if you like, Reconstruction is double-edged, because on the one hand, Reconstruction equips persons, not just citizens, with rights. So the 14th Amendment, which is where everything comes together, right? The 14th Amendment brings African American history and immigration history. That's the intersection point. So the 14th Amendment offers the first definition of national citizenship and writes it into the Constitution. You're born here, you're naturalized. It's a great thing. With my students, from day one, and Ryan is here, we ask, what is the 14th Amendment? Well, not sure. And then we figure it out, and then we say, imagine your life in America without that. So it doesn't just define citizenship, it extends rights of equal protection and due process to persons. Those persons include legally resident immigrants, including the Chinese. The Chinese are barred from naturalization under federal law until 1943. Chinese people cannot naturalize. Their children born on the soil are citizens. Look at that for a contradiction. They, as immigrants, have rights, and they know they have rights. And so they take literally thousands they file literally thousands of legal suits with support, actually, from big money, Ted, from the Chinese 6 companies. They're very organized and active. All right, so that's one side of Reconstruction. That's the beginning of what you might call an egalitarian jurisprudence, with Chinese immigrants as the agents of this process. The other side is that Reconstruction creates a national state capable of doing what no individual state can do. No individual state can control national borders. The national government can. So there's the bifurcation, Anna. It's double-edged. It's not that history just goes down one of those paths, because it tilts more towards the national sovereignty, but unnaturalized citizens who do not have access to citizenship do have rights under the 14th Amendment, and they know it in the late 19th century. Helena? Yeah.
Thanks a million. This is fascinating. Again, I haven't read it yet, but I'm just wondering, because there usually is there a gender dimension? Is there a gender perspective? And is there a role for marriage? What role does marriage play in?
Yes. Thank you, Helena. So we're just talking about naturalization, and there's a whole dimension and thread. So naturalization, the one thing the Constitution does on immigration is it says Congress can devise a uniform rule for naturalization. It's still implemented at the state level, but there's a uniform rule. So it's written in the 1790s into law, and it's great. You take an oath of allegiance, you spend a few years here, and you learn the ways of the country, and you can become a citizen. Proof of good character, stay here for 5 years. Pretty much what we have today. In those terms, it's about the most egalitarian naturalization policy you could imagine, because you can cast off your prior allegiance, something that's impossible under British law, and you can become a US citizen if you're a free white person, right? So that's the key. This is for free white people. For women, women usually don't go through the process of naturalization in the first half of the 19th century. There are few rights pertaining, women are citizens, but there are few rights pertaining to female citizenship. For example, they can't vote. Where naturalization is important for women is widowed women who need to secure title to property. If you follow that story through the modifications to the law from 1855 onwards, the woman simply assumes the nationality of her husband. And after 1907, I believe 1907 to 1922, a woman, an American-born woman who marries a foreigner, loses her nationality and acquires his. But imagine if the foreigner is a Chinese immigrant. He can't become a citizen. Therefore, she loses her citizenship and cannot get citizenship through him. That's one dimension, Helena. Another is when we come to Chinese exclusion. We mentioned race, we mentioned class, but the Page Act in 1875 is directed at what is categorized under the law as lewd and immoral behavior. And that is a code word for prostitution. And the Page Act seeks to exclude Chinese women, and all Chinese women except the elite are suspect and are subjected to consular inspection abroad. So this has a class and gender dimension. By 1890, partly as a result of the Page Act, Chinese-born men in the United States outnumber Chinese-born women by a ratio of 27 to 1. That's gendered social engineering. Stephanie, did I see your hand? Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, Michael. That was wonderful, and I really look forward to reading this now that the semester's over. So, but listening to you, Kevin, I wanted to ask if you would talk a little bit about the concept of sovereignty that you invoked a little while ago.
Yes,
so
yeah.
Clearly central here.
Yeah.
And whether I'm inferring correctly that your argument would then actually be that even though some kind of sovereignty is posited by the United States since its formation as a republic, there actually isn't any real claim or possibility of sovereignty in a national territorial sort of sense until the Civil War and emancipation.
Yeah. So the question of sovereignty came late in the book, and I mean this book did take 10 years, and I thought I had finished it. Steve, I told you this story more than once. I thought I had finished the book, and because it had been through peer review, and I sent it to my editor, and I thought, finally, I'll get this into production. And a couple of months later, she sent me a 2-page email, and she said, this is fine. It's very polished and accomplished and deep research. And said, I could publish it as it is, or you can go back to your office and do some deep thinking about what is the central claim that you're trying to make. You keep saying there's a connection between immigration and slavery, but what is the central claim? Can you articulate that claim and then make it the connecting thread through the chapters? So as some of you know me, I'm kind of an instant responder on email. I sometimes respond even before you've written it. So I'm on that end of that spectrum. This one took me 2 weeks. That's my editor, Susan Ferber at Oxford, who for me is a superb editor. And I responded to Susan. I said, look, thank you. You did me a favor. I really have to rethink this. So I thought about it in terms of sovereignty, Stephanie, and then when I had that figured out, I got back to Susan and I said, yeah, sovereignty. She said, well, you're not putting that in the title. that's and I said, the subtitle? And she said, no, don't. But, so I had to read about sovereignty. And this is the way I worked. As I said, I worked empirically, inductively, right? And I came across these concepts in political science and sociology and constitutional law and then read into them. And so sovereignty, the way it works in this book, so I don't approach sovereignty a priori, right, as something that has that I can define and then apply a model. I approach sovereignty as an argument, an ongoing argument, a set of questions and answers about who can control mobility. That's taking place locally at the state level through police power. And I go so far as to say, and I don't know what people will think of this, is that the claim to national sovereignty that is made at the end of the story is essentially the state police power writ large. It's the same logic of control that I see in the state level and that we talked about with the Black Sea Men, that this is becoming a claim writ large. It's only through the Civil War and Reconstruction that can happen. And it's only as what we have is a nation state in formation, and we have an empire in the making. And it's only then, it seems to me that as the United States enters onto the national stage, it is entering with this conception of sovereignty. So much of the the cases that are at the heart of the book, they are invoking international law the whole way through. Whether it's to do with confining black seamen in South Carolina, or whether it's the uber claim of national sovereignty. Final thing I want to say on that is, once that claim is articulated, it's articulated in 1889 in the Chinese exclusion case, very, very forcefully, the notion of power inherent in sovereignty. And we've talked about the wider context for that. But at that time that it's articulated, literally hundreds of native groups on this soil are making claims to territorially bounded sovereignty. And so that's where Native American history and immigration history come back together, because the claim to power over immigration coincides with the termination of treaty making, imposed citizenship, allotment, all of that. It always leads into another story. So I don't know if that answers the question, Stephanie. Yeah. Kim, yeah.
Would you be willing to say anything about the implications of your argument for what's going on now with respect to states struggling over controlling their borders? I'm thinking of Ron DeSantis sending migrants to Martha's Vineyard or other places as a sort of protest to the burden he describes being on not just Florida, but Texas, not even his own state. And it seems, in what way do you make sense of that kind of the skirmish, the state versus federal context in this moment?
I think the first thing I would say at the broadest level is that there is a harshness and a brutality to how immigrants are treated that I think in multiple ways I provide a genealogy for in the book by going all the way back to the story we've been discussing this evening. So in some ways, of course, immigration falls into its own category of law. And we see the Chinese immigration fell into an even harsher category. But so I approach it that way. Specifically, your question, the problem of immigration in a slaveholding republic is a problem of federalism, right? It's a problem of the relationship between national power and local power. And that conflict is still playing out in the United States today. What I see is a bifurcation in immigration federalism where it depends on where you live and how the local community defines the public good. That determines how immigrants will be treated. So we distinguish between immigration law in the sense of control of national borders and immigrant law in the sense of how are immigrants treated once they get here. Right, that's the distinction I'm making. I give examples from the past, like Proposition 187, that tried to deny access to benefits, even education, to the children of undocumented immigrants. That was thrown out by the courts. I give a more recent example from Arizona, which does similar things and permits racial profiling, essentially. And the court upholds that, and Justice Scalia at the time invoked the antebellum state laws as a good thing, explicitly in that case. Okay, but there's a bifurcation, just as there was in Reconstruction. It can go that way, or it can go another way. The other way it can go is sanctuary, refusing to comply with or enforce federal law. That's not the same thing as breaking federal law. A state can't break federal law, but a state can say, well, sorry, we're not agents of federal law enforcement. So here I see very striking parallel, and I don't often draw parallels of this kind, but I see a parallel with the antebellum period, because in the antebellum period, the southern states were saying the federal government has no business interfering with local affairs. It cannot touch slavery, except when it comes to fugitives. Then we need federal enforcement. So they're calling for a stronger federal fugitive slave law at the federal level, and they get it in 1850. But what did the states do, especially in New England? They passed personal liberty laws. The personal liberty laws are not saying we're going to break the law. They can't do that. But they're saying, we're not your agents. We're not going to enforce your law. So you see that bifurcation is taking place. California, New York, other states are moving in one direction, and some states you can use local power to monitor and to punish, or you can use local power to protect. And so I end the book on a surprising note for me as an American historian, because in much of what I study, naturally I associate the states' rights tradition with bad things, with slavery and with Jim Crow. Right? There's a whole genealogy there, and yet I end with just the point you've made, Kim, that I posed the question. I wrote this book during the Trump administration, and we have to say that policies on immigration don't then reverse themselves straight away after administrations like that. If you have federal policies like the ones we've seen, I kind of end with the question, where it comes full circle, is there merit and hope in local sovereignty and in local power? New York State has a bill before in Albany, before the legislature. It's been there a long time, to define state citizenship as applying to all legally resident members of our community, regardless of their background, where they came from, including the power to vote in local elections. That's one way you could go, and then you can go in others. So it's an ironic way to end the book, given the awful power, the awful force of local power earlier in the book to control free black people in particular and the interstate slave trade, and then I pose that question at the end. Maybe it's a slim glimmer of hope, I don't know. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because I read, just very briefly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about this issue in your introduction. You come back to it at the end.
Yeah.
And I read it as a kind of stopgap measure.
Yeah.
As opposed to because ultimately the argument is resting upon states' rights, which is highly problematic. And I didn't read it's your book, right?
Yeah.
I didn't read you to be saying this is we need to return to states'
rights. No. This is the path forward. A stopgap measure is a good way of putting it, and I think I end by saying, well, of course, federal guarantees would be much more effective. But if you have a particular kind of federal policy at the moment I'm writing the book, a stopgap is a great way of putting it, Mike. Wish I had put it that way. So.
Are there other questions or challenges, interventions?
Just have a question about the Page Act, and as you put it, with Chinese restriction as a sort of pernicious argument that all Chinese are coolies and therefore are slaves and therefore should be kept from coming to the United States. If that is the same kind of logic about the Page Act and about Chinese women are also therefore all prostitutes, is that explicitly laid out in relation to the 14th Amendment with the attempt to prevent Chinese women from coming to the United States and having children and therefore more Chinese citizens? Or is that just a kind of coincidental argument that kind of makes sense? Or do you see that like playing out explicitly at any point? Or is anybody making this within or without Congress? Or
so an explicit argument on the kind of gendered social engineering that I referred to earlier, I don't think I think I don't see that, I detect it. The anti-slavery rhetoric in which Chinese exclusion is presented is both highly disingenuous and highly powerful and persuasive. I think that's what I would say. So I must say I'm kind of overwhelmed with gratitude to everybody who's here this evening. I can't begin to thank everyone individually. I do want to thank you, Mike, and I'll leave you to close the program, and all of you. And I hope we have plenty of wine downstairs. That's what I'm trying to say. Mike, did you want to?
Well, I've heard repeatedly that, and obviously would be the case, that a number of you have not had opportunity to read the book. Hopefully you have been inspired to, in fact, read the book. It's a fantastic book, and elegantly written, well researched. So I commend you for a wonderful accomplishment, and thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Michael.